My conversation today is with author, scholar, and translator David Pantano. David's translation of the work of 19th century Italian alchemist and Hermetic philosopher Giuliano Kremmerz in the 2022 Inner Traditions release of The Hermetic Physician with Marco Daffi showcases his grasp on Kremmerz's complex philosophy. Further, his book entitled The Magic Door, a study on the Italic Hermetic Tradition, highlights his profound enthusiasm for an encyclopedic knowledge of the inner traditions of the Italian peninsula from the time of Rome onward, which were instrumental in the preservation of the spiritual traditions of the West and the birth of the Renaissance. Speaking with David was a delightful and humbling experience in which I was continually illuminated concerning the scope of history, esotericism, and spirituality that this particular branch of esoteric study embodies. His work is of inestimable value to any serious student of Hermeticism and the Western esoteric traditions, and a boon to any enthusiast of history in general. Though perhaps not currently as thoroughly investigated by modern practitioners and researchers as other periods, the Italic trajectory of the Western traditions is certainly receiving good treatment in David's hands. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast.
What I'm interested in, because it's something that I have found to be very useful in occult research and in practice, is just language in general and etymology. It's something that fascinates me. I grew up with another language in my home. My father was from Greece. My mother's side of the family is Italian, but she didn't speak it. What brought you into the realm of translation? Is that something that you kind of pursued a degree for? I mean, had you been doing that in a different milieu beforehand, or?
Well, yeah, I did take at university languages, primarily the Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, and I have an interest in that area. Translation is more a means to an end for me than an actual profession. I consider myself an author, a scholar, a historian, researcher primarily. Translation is just a means to get to what my research entails. So, and I actually do. Speaking of translation, I'm because of my studies in the Romance languages, I have I guess a sympathy for words in the vernacular. So whether English or any of the other languages I mentioned that have a Latin base, and because I think my study, my research over the years, the original meanings of those Latin roots is something that I like to discover and to bring back up to light. So example would be vir, which in ancient Roman or ancient Latin terms represented the distinguished man, the realized man. And the roots or the cognate of vir, we have like virtue. And it's taken on different meanings. Virtue in the sense, it's mostly in language, it has a moralistic component, whereas actually in the ancient Roman context of vir is a man who was manly, who was lived by principled behavior, someone who wasn't easily compromised. And I guess the greatest exponents of that would be the ancient Stoics, the Marcus Aureliuses, the Senecas, Cincinnatis, that type of thing, who lived a very astute and austere life based on very simple principles. They were considered vir. They were considered man in its most accomplished aspects.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Because recently I taught a course. It's going on right now, but I taught the first part of it at the Institute for Hermetic Studies on the 3 books of occult philosophy. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of different translations, right? You've got the JF, and then the Tyson, and then the Purdue one, which is in my opinion that's probably the best one to use. But I was referencing back to some of the earlier Latin manuscripts, and yeah, I mean, because right all over the entirety of that text is covered in virtus, virtutum, all of it, and it's the most obscure. It's the most heavily used, and it's the most obscure Latin word. So I really had to try and figure out what this word meant, because the root, as you know, is exactly what we're talking about, vir, that kind of man in its fullness. And so I think the definition I arrived at, and really also Eric Purdue, was power.
Yeah, it's cognitive, like with the ancient Greek term called arete.
Yes,
accomplishment of perfection.
Excellence.
And if you want to expand the influence, it's reflective in the German Ur, as U and V are interrelated. The actual figurative representation of U itself changed from a V to a U. So if you look at what vir, it actually represents Ur, which has primordial roots on it, and also representative of fire, of that fire principle, which has very strong hermetic components and representations as well.
Yeah. So is that the root of just now that we've touched upon this, is that kind of the source of the name for the Ur group? Julius Evola and.
Definitely so. Yes.
Okay,
Definitely
that's
so.
great.
There actually was around the same time in the 1920s a journal called Vir, and that Evola was associated with. So that's actually something I haven't written about, but I've had, as part of my research, I've actually come across that the actual name itself probably was a reflection, and it's written about in those actual manuals, in the Ur manuals, on the importance of vir, and how that the meaning has how that meaning has troped or transformed over the ages to represent something that what it originally meant.
Wow, that's excellent. And I know that we're kind of we're going to be talking tonight about personages and ideas within the Italic, Hermetic tradition. I know that's that was the central theme of your book, The Magic Door. But I wanted to talk about Kremmerz for a second, since we were talking about your translation of his. Very interesting guy for me, because from what I can tell, he's still not really well known in a lot of esoteric societies and communities, really. But he's one of the lesser known figures, of that time period. And a couple of years ago, I just randomly pulled off the shelf at a bookstore the Hermetic Science of Transformation, and it really floored me. It was a really solid translation, and the thing that I loved about it is he was constantly adjuring the reader towards this idea of exactly what we're talking about here, vir, this kind of this prerequisite to an initiatic path is self-development, really, before you're ready to take steps into things like magic and stuff like that. But I'm still a little hazy on Kremmerz's background. Where does he figure in all that?
Sure, I think, and I totally agree how you summarized and characterized Kremmerz in the occult world. Then he's a vastly underrated and vastly important figure in 20th century occultism. He was a hierophant in the sense that he not only was a practitioner, but he was a very strong doctrinaire as well in terms of his writings, and he had written probably around 20 books, and I think it's only now that we're starting to scratch the surface, one or two that actually been translated into English. In terms of his standings, he was a prodigious individual since an early age, where he had develop certain powers, certain faculties that were out of the norm. In his family, that he's from Portici, which is a small town outside of Naples. He was born in 1861, died in 1930. He connected with these Italic Egyptian school, that is a school of teachings that go back to Cagliostro, and prior to Cagliostro to a savant named Prince Raimondo de Sangro. And so Kremmerz was associated with this school, and the practice that he had his strongest affinity for was Hermetic healing. And it was a time, I guess, in the late 1800s, around 1880, there was a cholera pandemic in Europe that affected Naples pretty severely, and wanted to use his powers of intuition, of magnetism, to be able to make a difference, to be able to supplement infirmities with positive energy, and see if that made a difference. So he's very much started out as an experimenter. He attended various mediums and learned from mediums of that time, which was very popular spiritism. But he was kind of disgusted with that, because people would go there and they would be wowed, and ectoplasm would in some cases be manifested. But in the end, people went away no better off than when they started. So he was interested more in that transformative component, in inner alchemy. And that's where the Vir comes in, because in the ancient classical representation of a hierarchy of beings, the Vir is cognitive with the hero. They're a level above the human, and a level below. In some cases, they're actually supersede the gods, the divine ones. And so Vir was very much something that he wrote about as representing this stage of development that one can tap into some untapped or unresourced faculties to be able to elaborates, I guess, one's individual powers and extra sensitivities.
Yeah, and I really got the sense that he that was the whole thing about reading him, was that I got the sense that he spoke from a place of deep insight rather than just this rote accumulation and regurgitation of knowledge. He really touched me in a way, in particular. Yeah. I didn't know that about him, that he used magnetism. That's fascinating. That happens to be one of my favorite subjects about that time.
Right. Yeah, mine as well. And that's one of the components that attracted me to Kremmerz as well. So he had a very complex ideology of magnetism. It had to do with harmonizing the macrocosm with the microcosm. So
that's Hermetic.
Yeah. So there was various celestial configurations where qualities of energy needed to be tapped into. So this is all part of developing this inner sense, this inner intuitive understanding of the forces, of the various qualities of forces, but also quantities. And that's where the Hermetic chain came into, is that we can tap in individually into various types of qualities, but that can be augmented, so almost like a magnifying glass, when other energies are aggregated and condensed into a quantum of energy, and then used for beneficial purposes.
That's fantastic, actually, because in combing through the Agrippa stuff, actually, there's some intimation of exactly that, and I think Agrippa calls it the gifts of many stars.
Nice.
Yeah, utilizing that in terms of an aggregate for natural magic. Really, I mean, he was a proponent of theurgy, but yeah, it's I loved his philosophy regarding the rectification of the microcosm and the macrocosm, because that is one of, I think, at least in the Hermetic lineages of initiatic training here in the West. I mean, it's a sine qua non. You know, it's like that is what's going on in a lot of quote unquote outer door, outer order initiation. There's this kind of alchemical formula that's attempting to reorganize your spiritual architecture and your psychology towards, you know, to try and make the pattern of your microcosm more closely resemble the patterns of the macrocosm. So I really enjoyed that about him. I actually ordered your book, The Magic Door, and I'm very, very excited to dive into it. And I hope we can have another conversation either on here or just in person about it, because I'm so excited. Especially, you did a great interview with Rudolph for Thoth Hermes, and there's a bunch of stuff in there that I kind of picked from. But and I've been hearing excellent things about everything that you do. But so your work, The Magic Door, you know, you've oriented yourself towards this Italic Hermetic tradition, and kind of when I think of some of that stuff, Florentine Renaissance comes to mind. But for some of our listeners that are just being introduced to you, your work, and this, you know, this term, the Italic tradition, could you sort of give us a brief rundown of what exactly that is?
Sure. Italic in the sense that in the peninsula, the Italian peninsula, there are two significant eras. One is the Latin or Roman era, and then there was the post-Latin or Italian, where the vernacular took precedence. And the two different typologies, I talk about that in The Magic Door, the twin soul, and two actually polar changes that occurred as a result of that transfer from a Roman animus to a Italian animus. So that's the reference to Italic. It references to those two periods or two eras of a Roman consciousness and one of an Italian consciousness. And some of the key figures would be in the Italian, you know, after the medieval, would be the dawn of the Renaissance with Dante and his spiritual journey that represented in the Divine Comedy, where there's this tripartite division of or levels of being that one needs to go through, which is mirrors the alchemical regimens of a black, of a white, and a red, the inferno or the underworld, the white, the purgatorio, and the red or the paradiso. So that paradigm, that initiatic Weltanschauung is common to both the Italic and both to the Latin and to the Italian eras of the history of occultism in the peninsula of Italy. And in the Roman area, you get that in Virgil in his descent of Aeneas into the underworld through the golden bow. And I talk about that. It's actually the opening monologue in my Magic Door. I deconstruct that ritual of the golden bow, of the ritual of the priest kings of the Lake Nemi, which preceded actual historical times. So that sets the motive, the leitmotif for the whole book, and you could say for the whole Italic tradition. It ties back into the Vir. The Vir is something that is not invested on. You're not born a Vir. It's something that you achieve, and it's this transformation. You enter into this abyss, this descent into hell, to in Jungian terms, to come to terms with your shadows, with your dark areas, to clean that up. And from that, there's the purgation that occurs, that one must have the strength and the insight to be able to identify the path of who you are in terms of an identity as an individual energy or force, but also in a collective, in a tradition. And then to integrate those powers. And then once you're at that level that white regimen or the albedo, then you can attempt the really ascension to that body of light that's found in the Paradiso. So that, in a nutshell, like, is sort of like the leitmotif, or the initiative paradigm that is represented in this tradition, and that you'll find in any of the Renaissance Neoplatonists or Hermeticists, from Ficino to Giordano Bruno, Pico della Mirandola, Tommaso Campanella, even all the way up to Cesare della Rivera in his The Magical World of Heroes. It's all talking about the same thing. And we bring it contemporarily to the 20th century with Kremmerz, Regini, and Julius Evola. You're really tapping into the same viewpoint, and it's just brought up to date with modern languages, with more scientific and psychological verbiage than what was available back in the back in the early eras of Rome, or even of the Renaissance. So that, in a nutshell, gives hopefully the readers an indication what we're talking. We're talking about magical heroes, or Veers. Mm-hmm. We're talking about this purification, or this transformation, metamorphosis, that involves a descent into hell, that involves a purgation of your components that are bring you down as an individual, as a human. The humus side of it, the humanimal, which is what Kremmerz calls it, that you can transform into what Dante calls the angelica butterfly, the angelica farfalla, so that when you're able to transform into this transformed being, you have the foundation to rise to a higher level, and there's various components that if we have time we can get into, but that's involved with this body of light and inner transformation and alchemy.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating to me, and I've even seen that, as early as in contemporary times in Western initiatic circles. I really, I don't make any secret about it. Obviously, I'm the system I came up in was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and I still work that system, and I'm down here in Western North Carolina. But what is so interesting to me at the I guess, if you want to call them inner levels, or quote unquote adept levels, particularly even the stuff that's just in the Black Book with Regardy, they're talking about the transcending of the era of worship and tribute to tutelary deities, and taking on that hero's path, as literally sort of like the like you're saying, the mythic narrative, right? The symbolic, the symbolic tale of how an individual undergoes that process, and sort of, I guess the word he uses is transcends fate in that way. Yeah. I think what he says is the true adept moves from the sides to the center. And for me, that's got all sorts of connotations wrapped up with the trials of Hercules and all stuff like that. So I think it's it's quite a powerful thing, and it's with us in the present day in modern initiation too. If that's what you're paying attention to, because there is kind of like a buffet style thing happening right now with occultism, and you don't have to pay attention to that through line, but I would say that is really present when you're doing that kind of work.
Yeah, no, I would second that. There definitely is a smorgasbord of people who are working in this inner path, and they it's a pick and choose type of thing, and I guess you were to various results. A lot of it just goes back into circles, and some of it you see people getting hung up in mirages and into fool's gold. But I think that's all part of the process of where you're at individually and psychically, that you come up to false ends, and you come up to you veer off the beat, you veer off the right path, you go on to a tangent that leads to ends that aren't what you thought they would be. But I think that's all part of the learning curve. That's all part of the apprentice's work, is that you learn to know what you know and what you don't know, and sometimes what you don't know is part of what the path you're on, and it takes courage that, you know, that something that leads to a dead end actually will, you know, open up another vista to you that wasn't available if you stay on the same path. And I'm finding a lot of in occult literature that they're all everyone's talking about the same thing, and it's just, you know, it just goes around in circles. There isn't a lot of breakthrough or new insights and light into inner development. And I think it's good that you, in a comparative sense, you can look into some of the practices in the East, but, you know, from my perspective, I'm Western, and the path that I'm interested in is a Western path that doesn't subjugate the individual, that tries to drown the individual into this greater nirvanic type of whole, that the individual is, we're all stars, and it's finding that connection and finding that path to that celestial light is part of the process. So I don't have, and I'm not a purist in the sense that you need to, you know, stick to this curriculum and so forth. I think even my own background, my own interest as a research, I've gone into, I've looked at all different types of traditions from the West and the East, and there's some synergies that definitely have helped to explain components of the West that the East have a greater elaboration and greater clarity, and vice versa. So to answer that question, I agree there's a smorgasbord. I think where I would challenge it is when you're starting to read the same things over and over again. It's just at that point, you may want to stop and think of, you know, do some own direct work yourself, some inner light, and not be so reliant on someone else's experiences and knowledge breakthroughs.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, and I think that's important for a lot of people to hear, and that just goes back to the power of, you know, for me, the power of Kremmerz's work, because you really get a sense that he has insight, which is, you know, experience. You know, he definitely has that kind of experience. But one question that had kind of I've been rolling over in my head is, so we've got this Italic Hermetic tradition, right? It's Hermeticism, really, as opposed to Hermetism. But how does it differ in terms of the Hermetism that we find in late antiquity? So is it the same, like textual canons? For instance, I've seen like the Somnium Scipionis, the Dream of Scipio. I've seen that like lumped in with, like, Westcott put it in his Collectanea Hermetica, and some people have written about that in a Hermetic kind of way. And obviously, you know, Cicero wrote that. But the thing is, a lot of people would kind of, you know, challenge that idea that is a Hermetic treatise.
Well,
so what's the difference?
Well, you'll see that in my book once you get it in the Magic Door. I have a chapter on the Dream of Scipio by Cicero. So in terms of what differentiates this Italic current of the Hermetic tradition, I think it's just that. Its roots are based in this Greco-Roman Egyptian motherboard of practices, of traditions, of doctrines, that it doesn't alienate into Hebraic Kabbalism and into other type of traditions. It's pretty defined in its contours, that it sticks within this basin of knowledge and practices, and the reference points are those that you mentioned. So what is the connection of the Somnium Scipio with Hermeticism? The art of memory, the art of recalling past lives, that amnesias that the Greeks came up with, is that to understand yourself, you need to understand your innate qualities, your innate dimensions, from those that have been developed as a result of societal conditioning, which may not represent who you truly are. So you want to get to that irredefinable component of who you are as a being. To do that, you need to go inside yourself and to separate the various accretions of societal conditioning. So how do you do that? The art of memory is a very strong practice to do that. And that was taken up 1,000 years later by Ramon Lull in his Ars Memoria, and then Bruno took a shot at it, and then your favorite author, Cornelius Agrippa, wrote on that as well. So it's all connected.
Yeah. So, and also, I mean, it's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but the public assumption or the mainstream assumption is that, so kind of Ficino was the door for, I mean, I guess the Medici, right? Just the whole system there that was going on while Cosimo was alive. Because I, if I have it correctly, so Ficino translated not only the complete works of Plato and the extant works of Aristotle, but the Corpus Hermeticum. And but the thing is, what's interesting to me is that Cosimo de' Medici was the one who was sort of finding this stuff from the monks that he had in these monasteries, searching for these texts. It's very curious to me that a businessman would have these things on his radar, and know exactly who to bring them to, and be able to gauge their importance, right? Because at a certain point, he basically pushes Plato off of Ficino's desk and says, "Here, translate this."
But that's the key insight, how you just defined that, is that what differentiated Florence from other urban centers in Europe was exactly that, was that humanistic culture that put value on culture, on works of wisdom, on the perennial tradition, and not just on commerce, and not just on business, and just not on military. So the inner development, the spiritual development, the pursuit of languages, both current but also so-called dead languages like ancient Greek and Hebrew, and the first shots at trying to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphics was around that time. So that's what really differentiated Florence. It was a cultural hub. And of course, around that time, in the 1420s, Constantinople was invaded and conquered by the Turks. Constantinople was one of the last bastions of ancient classical knowledge. So you had a lot of these scholars that left from Constantinople and took up residency in Florence, and hence the Picatrix, the Hermetics, the Corpus Hermeticum. A lot of these texts that were either lost or forgotten or were very difficult to find became more widely available through the translations from scholars like Ficino and Ludovico Lazzarelli, Pico della Mirandola. So it was a very strong cultural hub that prided itself on ancient wisdom and finding your roots and origins. And that's sort of what we bring it on. We're going back and forth in eras and centuries and millennium, and I think that's okay. But when you look at the Ur group, the 1930s, that Julius Evola and Arturo Rugrini, it was basically in those same premises, is that they were feeling that, after World War One, there was a sense of emptiness, that life didn't have meaning, and so there was a search to their origins, like who are we and what tradition do we belong to, and how can we bring back to life? How can this old stump of a tradition germinate with new and flower and come up with new impulses for stimulation? And you saw that in the works of the Ur group, and what some of the other works that came subsequently to those tomes, primarily like what I've translated from Marco Daffy, who was a disciple of Giuliano Kremmerz.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me too, because it wasn't just specifically sort of like one aspect or type of philosophy that was being explored. It was kind of there was this nexus point right there at the beginning of the Florentine Renaissance, where you had these texts, these corpuses, these bodies of work that had been missing for like 1,000 years, and all of a sudden, like you're saying, you have them reappearing at this very specific time, and and from there to, at least ostensibly, from that you have this cultural and even further kind of expansion of cultural rebirth. I mean, do you think that that philosophical movement had a catalytic effect to the Renaissance, or?
Well, definitely so. I mean, even if you look at some of the works from the famous Renaissance painters, the Judgment of Paris, which is a famous painting by Raphael, it's based on, and it's even in some of the writings on the works of Ficino. It was not a surprise that around this time in Renaissance eras, just north of Florence and Bologna, that the Tarot started to get currency. It was this Renaissance, this rebirth, and again, rebirth through a journey to find one's roots. And the roots were this Greco-Roman Egyptian basin. And there's this, in my book, The Magic Door, there's this passage where I translate this this very unknown manuscript called The Practice of Philosophical Ecstasy, where it actually traces a process of initiate who's able to turn off his mind, close his eyes, and float downstream, and how to get into these transitional states of mind to buffer out the profane world, and then open up your inner window to this magical world of spectral representations. So that's in the translation in the Magic Door, that is from a Renaissance text that some have attributed to Tommaso Campanella, who wrote The City of the Sun. Others claim it was Giordano Bruno. So yeah, it was very much a time, Ike, of experimentation spiritually and culturally. There was this fermentation, exchange of ideas, this rebirth of this ancient font of tradition that came through. And I think the reverberation to this day is still being felt. That the corpus hermeticums, the paintings, the work of art, the culture, it still is sort of like a high point that the Western society is yet to achieve, at least from a cultural level.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So as far as your examination of, some of the documents and I'm sure you've done a tremendous amount of synthesizing just by you talking about your book. I'm getting even more excited to kind of dive in, because I like stuff that explores the imaginal and things like that, because that's really where my bread and butter is. But from what you've seen, how much of a part did practical magic, as we might conceptualize it today, play a part in the Italic Hermetic tradition? What was there kind of an established, or were there people who were practicing like magic as we would conceive of it?
Oh, definitely so. The example you brought up would be Marsilio Ficino, who was born, according to his writings, an autobiography, under an auspicious sign, that the influence of Saturn weighed over his personality, and for him to buffer those Saturnian effects. So what does that mean? Is that he was prone to depressions and anxiety and foul moods, and that when he felt that Saturnian influence taking hold, that he would resort to his lyre and sing Orphic incantations, and that would raise his spirits from the sublunar level to this higher astral level. So that's an example itself at a personal level of magic and how important it was. But there's all kinds of components, and I write about it using various filters, the ars amatoria, or the art of love. And basically, magic comes down to two components of sympathies and antipathies. So antipathies is you want to avoid the negative things that happen to you, the illnesses, the bad lucks, the misfortunes, all those things. So there are certain practices that you can do both internally and externally, but also sympathies in terms of how to enrich your life internally and externally, you know, to find a mate, to get a good job, to do in life what you want to do, your vocation, to recall information, to be able to communicate. That requires all a sympathetic connection. So that those type of practices were front and center, came to birth or rebirth in the Renaissance. So there's a lot of texts, a lot of manuscripts that are written on magical practices, and from various levels. So not only at an astral level, but internal magic as well.
Yeah, and what I find pretty interesting is that there's modern magic, specifically magical orders, that have claimed a descent in the Western tradition from the Karegi circle.
Right, exactly.
You know,
Yes.
and which is really, it's cool for me to hear that, because, you know, an academic treatment of it you'll typically find that it was, you know, a villa where you know, Marsilio Ficino kind of ran his New Platonic Academy, I guess, but it was mostly kind of a loose affiliation, right, of artists and intellectuals and stuff. So I guess, just as an aside, it would really fulfill a fantasy of mine to someday find out that they were doing magic there.
Well, they definitely were doing magic. You read, the Ficillo has a book. It's very well translated by Sunni, I believe, on the 3 books of life, and one is on celestial magic, and it had a strong impact on Agrippa. That there are actually passages that he's taken directly from that, both he's attributed to it and not attributed. It was perhaps the most widely circulated book of magic in the Renaissance and post-Renaissance, and it set the foundation for further developments in the art of magic. And magic in itself is a word that has Chaldean and Persian origins. It means to make, and from that, there's that component of magic is about creation, creating truths. It's about using forms, so non-physical entities, to be able to inject with energies that actually precipitate into manifestations. Those type of concepts are developed conceptually wise into these various magical tones throughout the Renaissance and post-Renaissance eras.
Yes, thankfully so, because that's, you know, that's what we're drawing. That's what we draw on still to this day. I mean, through
and my work is to bring attention to them, and is to bring this whole Renaissance and Italic Hermetic tradition back to the forefront. Let's face it. I mean, the English world is sort of like the Rome of contemporary times, and it's making that connection, is not losing our roots, is bringing that forefront, and it's very noble roots, is very advanced and culturally and aesthetically and practically so valuable that we don't want to lose them or have them forgotten. So that's part of my vocation, and part of what I get a kick of is to see these doctrines and these authors and these heroes getting the attention that they deserve, that they can inspire other people to read up about them and to practice some of their works and to take their works further.
That's excellent. I absolutely appreciate that work, you know, because it seems as if, you know, the mainstream is only becoming aware of the involvement of this type of philosophy and sort of the magical worldview as part and parcel of things like the Renaissance, you know, and part and parcel of things like Neoplatonism or even Platonism. You know, my big thing is that I connect with both of my roots. You know, I've been to those places. I've walked, you know, through the piazzas in Rome, and I've been to the Duomo in Florence, and I regularly go to Greece, you know, to connect. I go to the Academy of Plato, its ruins and stuff right outside of Athens, and in my experience connecting with these early documents, I mean, like what I was taught was kind of in what I was taught to read as like discursive and intellectual. I'm now finding it to be like supremely mystical, which is
exactly. I mean, a great example would be Dante, where the scholarly types, the scholastic world or academia has like brought him down to this boring, curriculum that you take in high school. Do you take Shakespeare or Dante, and it's about, it's his imagination. It's actually a spiritual journey. That walk in the forest where he has his breakthrough, this portal, is actually an initiatic journey that he undertakes. And but that mysticism, that and the orders that he was with, the Fedeli d'Amore, which was a Templar organization, doesn't get any attention at all. Everything is like contextualized within this, it's a scholarly type of guy who wrote this beautiful poetry, but it just skims the surface. It doesn't open up to other filaments of lights that maybe people who are more mystical orientation can grasp to. And that's another component that in my book that I try to highlight is some of these authors that we just take for granted as part of the Western curriculum, like Virgil or Homer or Ovid and Dante. There's actually a very strong spiritual component. They were Vates. Vates means they were seers, and they were able to transcend their human self, to go inside and open up to this world that they've articulated in their books. And it's not just a fertile imagination. The imagination is a faculty they use, but the light that they receive is through these inner visions. And there's a whole process and methodology to achieve that. And they articulate that in the sixth book of the Aeneid, or in the 99 canticles of the cantos of the Divine Comedy. It's all written, but you need the eyes to see and the ears to hear. And that's what my books are about, is to show people that, to re-examine our traditions, that there's a lot of value and a lot of knowledge to be regained that, perhaps you overlooked because of your schooling and your education or your cultural influences, your television or whatever doesn't get to do justice.
Yeah. Well, one person that I kind of wanted to touch on just a little bit before we wrap up is kind of a controversial figure, but I find him great for several reasons. But obviously Julius Evola. I heard you mention something about him in the Thought Hermes podcast interview. I think you mentioned he was, and this was amazing to me. You mentioned he was actually encouraging activists against like political activism, which is
definitely so. Yeah.
that's incredible.
He just realized how shallow these people were, that they were just being influenced by forces that they had no control over. So, and they would, a lot of these political activists, mostly they were of the right. Evola was definitely of the right. He made no bones about that, but it's not anyways, we don't need to get into a political discussion. Yeah, Julius Evola was a shit disturber of his time. I equate it to how Giordano Bruno was. Giordano Bruno in the late Renaissance was the same thing. He was like stirring up the pot and getting the establishment all freaked out and shocking people. You can't say that, and you're a heretic and so forth. And he paid for it. Evola paid for it as well. He was crippled at the end of the war. But if you actually read his work and examine his principles, it's pretty clear he is not of a political party persuasion that a lot of people want to put him into.
Right.
He felt he was above that, and that the traditions, the values, the principles that he adhered to had nothing to do with that. But it's an ongoing. Even now, I'm hearing from colleagues in Italy that a convention on Evola was disrupted by protesters about him being fascist and racist, all that kind of stuff. And it's just censorism. It's just mind dumbing aspects of culture that really should be investigated and elaborated. As I said to Rudolph, and I'll say it here, is that for any seeker, don't become too attached to any writer or philosopher. Don't love them too much. Have a critical eye, and know yourself. Put yourself first, and that's what Evola was saying. Don't come to me to march with you, to raise a banner. Do some inner work, do some inner development. Free yourself of the prejudices. Free yourselves of these narrow-mindedness, of these conditioning that you've come through. And once you've got to that level, let's have a discussion.
Yeah, and I think one of the words that you used was autarky, which is true self-governance, self-rulership, and
Exactly.
it's a huge key. I mean, we talked about it earlier in the hermetic sense of initiation and rectifying the microcosm with the macrocosm, and this idea of veer. I think that that's something that, if anything, instead of censoring it, I think we need to look at it more closely. We need to be looking at his.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the society, especially Western society, is in just such a topsy-turvy, in a turmoil. So if we have these lights that can bring us to an orientation that has some meaning, that can connect with us, that can give us an orientation and a structure to find who we are and who we're meant to be, I think that needs to be promoted. That needs to be emphasized. And some of the more contingent things in terms of your political allegiances and that type of thing, it's just to me, it's just a wash. It's just missing the point. It's a waste of people's time.
I think it's great that the work you're doing is to, redirect our eyes and our ears to this work more deeply, because it can be overwhelming. There's so many figures and there's so many different texts and stuff. So it's really nice to have perhaps a primer on these things that shows what needs to be shown.
Well, I think one of the other goals, Ike, is that this Italic tradition is in fact a tradition. So there is some continuity to it. There is so though it's like we talked about earlier, this whole smorgasbord of different doctrines and philosophies, and it just kind of gets all meshed up in some sort of mushy new age type of messaging, which really doesn't help anything, because it's just all over the place. It's whatever you wake up and whatever idea pops into your head, you hear people spouting. So this is actually a tradition that has roots and it has branches and it has a trunk of knowledge that can lead to fruits and lead to some very interesting and very beautiful spiritual results.
Excellent. Well, I've got a canned question that I ask all my guests at the end, because I'm assuming most of my listeners are occultists, and boy, do we love books. So, but for anyone listening today that might want to learn more about the Italic traditions, are there any essential texts you might recommend? And of course, you can include your own.
Well, definitely, I would include. A good place to start would be the Magic Door, because it does cover this tradition from its mythical roots to the the last exponents, including Evola, we talked about, Kremmerz, we talked about, Marco Daffi was I think the last great initiate of this lineage. So that's all included in there. And the Hermetic tradition is a deep dive into the biography and the works of Giuliano Kremmerz, who's perhaps the foremost Hermeticist in the Western world, contemporary, at least of the last century. Those are two good books to start with, and then go back to the classics. Go back to the 3 Books of Life of Ficino. Go back to his symposium on love. Go to Pico della Mirandola's on the dignity of man. This is about understanding we have dignities as well. As individuals. Giordano Bruno has just a vast spectrum of knowledge. Go back to the classics, the Corpus Hermeticum. I think Cambridge University has done a really good translation of the 15 books. Go to the Picatrix. Go to Agrippa, the work that you've mentioned, Ike. That's a really good place to start. Go back to the Neoplatonists, both the Greek and the Romans, the Iamblichus, Proclus, Periphery. Go to the Pythagorean tradition, the Golden Verses. There's a really good by Fanis Press. It's about 40 years old now, called the Pythagorean Handbook, that has a lot of the translations of the base material of Pythagoras, which was a huge and really gets not the attention that it deserves. Affiliation of Western occultism. There's just so much knowledge and principles within that whole Pythagorean body of work. So that's a few recommendations that I would make to the reader if they're interested in this branch of tradition, that they could start with. The Magic Door is a good place, and then work your way back to the source.
Excellent. Well, David Pantano, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you being willing to come here and spend a little time with me this evening. Thank you so much.
Pleasure is all mine. Thanks, Ike, and thanks to the listeners for hanging in this way.